Welcome to another episode of Catalyzing Radical Systemic Change, where, in my own words, it's all about discovering, mapping, and cross pollinating what I think are the necessary building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead. I want to start this podcast with an own biographical excursion. For whatever reason, although I'm born in the south of Bavaria, from, I'd say, left wing, rather the political side of the hippie parents, I got confronted with indigenous wisdom very early in my childhood. Fact being that my father spent some time mainly with the North American tribes and specifically the Lakota tradition. That's one piece. And the other piece is that I come from now the fourth generation of people living off the land, meaning I come from a family where we were cultivating our own fruits and vegetables. For sure, in Germany, you can't do that like for 12 months in a row, but I would say some honest, maybe 8 months in a year we were living off the land. And I was truly growing up to pray for the land and say gratitude even for the plants that we were eating. Today's topic is about how can we preserve indigenous wisdom, and are there really techniques out there that exist for tens of thousands of years? I would definitely say, from my biographical background, a full on yes to both. And I really think we live in dire times where it's important to not only use indigenous to fig leaf some endeavors or to tokenize indigenism, but to really become aware that for many of the collective challenges that we face as humanity, let's say, for example, resilience in food supply chains, I think there are really a lot of possibilities to make use and incorporate ancient old wisdom. Having said all of that, it's my great pleasure to be in this virtual room together in between Guatemala, where I live, and Julia Watson, whom I met a couple of years ago at a beautiful gathering in the Swiss Alps. And we kind of, from the first moment, had a vibe going on. She is the author of a best-selling book. It's called Lo-TEK, written in a slightly different manner. And like always in the podcast, before we dive into the topic of Lo-TEK and radical indigenism, I want to have the listeners get to know you, Julia. So, like always, the question is, how does a Western-ish woman, what makes her be identified with and have such a deep knowledge and immersion with indigenous cultures? Julia, it's my great pleasure to share this deep dive podcast today with you. And yeah, I'm just curious to have the listener sense into who you are and what are the pivotal moments in your biography that tie you back into today's topic of the podcast. The floor is yours.
Hey, thank you, Alistair. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm going to take the listeners back to, I think, an incident which a lot of people will remember. It's something that really stuck out in my mind. It's the reason I wrote this next book. It's coming out in June, called Water. One of my first, most vivid memories of my childhood was watching TV, but sitting glued in front of the television. I was witnessing the first televised oceanic environmental disaster, which I didn't know at the time. I was 11 years old. It was the Exxon Valdez, and it was it's talked about now in reflection as one of those moments when many people around the world woke up to an understanding that there was a peril in our world that was existential. It was really being human made, and it was destructive beyond what we had really witnessed before. So this Exxon Valdez was a great oil spill that happened in a really pristine environment, and the images that were flashed across the television screen, as I remember them, were of these tiny, sick, feathered birds' bodies being washed in Dove household dishwashing detergent. And across the screen, you just heard reporters talking about how many hundreds of thousands of animals had been poisoned and died, and it covered, I think, thousands of kilometers of coastline in Alaska. And I remember going to my mother and saying, I'm going to be a marine biologist. This is what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. Like, the fast forward 15 years, I was studying architecture, and I I thought architecture was a really interesting mix of many, many different fields and subject matters, and it was um, a, a profession that I wanted to invest, my life in. And then in my second year of architecture, I took this one course. It was called Aboriginal Environment, and it was at my school, which was a profoundly progressive school where indigenous knowledge systems were part of our curriculum. Something that I think is still not seen today. But I was in this course and I was being exposed to all these understandings about landscape, food systems, habitation modes, urban morphologies, things that I had never ever seen before. And I'm this stage, I'm 19 years old. And what I experienced then was, I call it something like an unlearning of all these objective truths that I had been told about history, about geography, about architecture, about land, about story, narrative. And these were, like, what I'm talking about is very distinctly colonial perspectives. Even though I had had a education where uh, indigenous poets and writers and artists were really part of our education in Australia, it was a really different deep dive understanding that there were these, what I had learned was always shaped through a very specific Western perspective, and this was something very different. And that really shifted my, I think, really the way I view the world completely. And there is a something there's like a term for that. It's called two-eyed seeing, and it's a term that was uh, given by an indigenous elder, and he said that this is when you look at the world with the Western scientific understanding, and you also look at understanding indigenous perspectives as well, and it gives you a greater understanding of, well, a more holistic understanding of the world. And so that was sort of that big moment that shifted me in my career. And then I'll say, I think, years later, after working professionally as a landscape architect, which is what I went into next, I ended up teaching at Harvard and at Columbia here, where I am on the East Coast of what's called the United States of America. And I was asked to teach a technology course. And in that technology course, everything that I could find, all the literature, all the precedents, all the subject matters, it was all, again, framed through sort of a Western idea of progress. And I had been, previous to this, for the last 10 years, traveling the world, working with communities in UNESCO World Heritage Sites, talking about biocultural conservation projects, really trying to understand how do Western frameworks of conservation either dismantle indigenous systems of preservation and stewardship, or how do they work together. And it was in that course, when I was asked to teach technology, that I realized that this framing of technology was very, very much the similar framing to what I had been taught before I did that course on Aboriginal environments. It was completely and holistic, this objective truth of this is what is technology, and it's very much shaped by a short timeline, singular generation understanding, an extractivist modality, and and a superiority about how we interact with our ecosystems and our environments and everything else that lives in those spaces. And and so I started to think about the ways that I had experienced the communities that I had worked with and shared knowledge with, how they thought about technology, how they cleaned water and harvested water, how they created energy systems through um, natural, by capturing the sort of natural energy that saturates our earth. And I started to draw parallels and say, well, we can look at this particular type of technology as this, but then there are all these other technologies that come from indigenous and local communities and their traditional knowledge systems. And I started to blend this course of technology. And from that, the minute that started to happen, I was like, okay, one day this is going to be a book. I had all my students sign a form to say that they would contribute to this book that was somewhere in the ether about 7 years further down the track. And yeah, that was really the birth of Lo-TEK.
So I wonder, I still want to talk a little bit more about terminology before we go into the genesis and the birth of the book and your life ever since that unfolding. I think one of the perspectives that I'm very, very frequently taking myself in my work, and how I build my portfolio, but certainly in the podcast, is to take an intergenerational perspective. So trying to seed projects or fund projects that go way beyond my own short lifetime. I'm mid 40s, most certainly in, I don't know, 40, 50, 60, something like that years, I won't again be here in this like flesh made vessel as Alistair. And I still remember when we met at Clusters Forum that I ordered the book, and it was one of these four big books together with like Tools of Titans, for example, that I kept on, always when I had a break, 5, 10, 15 minutes, and kept on really just paging through the book, and it all felt so natural, so organic, as if there was a way where we as humans could rather mimic nature, like biomimicry, and rather learn from the cycles of nature instead of, other terminology that you used, to have a short term extractive perspective
Yeah.
on building technology to extract energy or matter or whatever out of that living organism, because it's a living organism that we're part of. It's a living complex system like Gaia, the mother planet, whatever we want to call it. And we as human species, as a dominant species on the planet, obviously depend on the mother organism. So I wonder how we can tie some of the terminology into the genesis, of Lo-TEK, like the book. When did it exactly come? You were sharing a little bit while you were teaching in university, but it was a multi-year process. And then maybe after that, start also sharing how that shifted the way you as a human being show up in your career, because the way that book has like also tremendously shaped Julia as the human being, like vice versa. Like it's a dialectic process in between the book and you as a human being.
Yeah. I mean, I think what that seed or that kernel, what you're asking, from the work I'd been doing previously, when I was working at UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and even what I had studied, and did my thesis on when I was at Harvard at the design school. I was actually there studying sacred landscapes. That was up until really I had written the book. That was my field of expertise. Um, and all the UNESCO World Heritage Sites I had been to were sacred natural spaces where people over time either they're spaces where they're sacred because there's where messages were received, or they're sacred because of the lens through which people view them, and people go there and give their sacred energy to that space, and they keep on resanctifying that space. And so I had uh really been focused on trying to understand what I said before, sort of that relationship between conservation of a space, like for here in the United States, Yosemite National Park, which is a really important national park. But prior to that, there was a really incredibly sacred space for the Awanichi people who, through the process of making that a national park, were completely removed, or their houses razed. Um, they were basically displaced from the natural space because it was made into a preserved natural space. And this is a formula that, born in the United States, has been replicated across the globe, that in the preservation of nature, we remove the custodians of that territory, and the stewards, the people who had actually fostered and managed and curated the biodiversity in really close concert, in a really dynamic flow with that ecosystem, to make that space and that place as diverse and healthy and vibrant and energetic as it was. And so that was my really
Can I tie
important
into
lens.
that,
Yeah,
Julia? Because I
yeah.
love it. Because we're both nerds, right? And I always love to educate people on stuff most people just don't know. So, and I'm well aware that, let's say, the process design of the first let's say, national and natural monuments of the United States has been exported globally by very well-known organizations, such as, for example, the WWF,
Yep.
and the people actually stewarding the land for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, who were the stewards of the ecosystem, got eradicated. And I find that very interesting and very nuanced, because it breaks up the dichotomy in between that's the good, let's say, environmental protection agencies, and that's the bad corporates.
Yeah.
Actually, the reality of it all is way messier.
Yeah.
Can you sketch, besides that example in Yosemite, one or two or three, not five, other examples where you know that people have really been displaced from the land, whereas now fancy Western high paying tourists, they
Yeah.
fly in, do a safari tour. They really think they're giving back to the community, and they're not even aware
Yeah.
that thousands of people, whole tribes, have been eradicated and displaced just that Western tourists now can enjoy safari
Yeah.
tourism,
Yeah.
right? I think many people are just not aware of the complexities and the entanglement of these intergenerational issues.
Yeah. I mean, I'll sort of add to what you're saying. You're talking about this savior, what I call in the book the savior complex, of saving the landscape, or saving the biodiversity, which is kind of the mission of conservation. And then the other sort of corporate agenda, which you're alluding to, is the superiority complex, the extractivist mode. We're above nature, and it's there as a resource for us to extract and use. And then the other model, the stewardship model. And this model of stewardship is not based on ownership. It's based on mutual care, respect, and the idea that humanity, our original role, is the custodianship and caretakers of the planet and the whole interconnected, entangled web of life and life force that exists within it, that we are part of, but that we also have been told by the creator that we are here to take care of that, one another and everything else. This is our role. We never have to question why we're here, who we are, what we're here for. This is it. It's always been it. We need to just come back to it and remember once again. But I think even that model that you're speaking to, I can give you, two models. You're talking about the Maasai, and this sort of Serengeti landscape where people come and they come to do safari, or they come to, even worse, on these sort of uh, to do hunting. Um, so that whole area of the Maasai territory crosses over different country borders, but and this is also true of the Plains Native Americans, that the Maasai use fire. And the way that they use fire is they burn the grasslands, or just also to stop wildfires, but also they burn the grasslands to move the wildebeests around a humongous territory, which they're sort of semi-nomadic taking care of. And what follows that is all the wild animals. They're following the line and the trail of the wildebeest, but the wildebeest are moving through that landscape based upon the fire, based upon the burning of the Maasai. Now, what happens with different types of hunting, with cutting up the land into different sort of conservation parcels or territories that have ownership between different groups, is that these wildebeests cannot move through the landscape in their migration, or their really large migrational, regional migrational cycle anymore. The fires can't be burned. So you get like destruction of soils, you get destruction of wildfires, you get disruption of migration patterns. Then you don't have that, a very fluid, flexible migratory pathway, and everything that comes after that, the regeneration of forests, the regeneration of grasslands, food sources, happening in correlation with that huge migratory pattern. The same thing happens in the plains when the buffaloes were removed. The buffaloes would move through that landscape as the fires were set, and the fires were set by the indigenous communities to actually regenerate soil ecosystem for the benefit of hunting, for bringing new life and sort of food sources into those landscapes for all other animals. They're just ways of co-managing landscape and stewarding landscape. Um, One other example I can give, which is a really different type of example, is there's a site in the US, and you might know it if you ever saw Close Encounters of, I think, Close Encounters of the first kind, third kind. I can't remember which one. Really old movie from, I think, the early 80s. But it's a movie about, us being visited by aliens. And in the like end of the movie, this spaceship comes down and it lands on top of this humongous rock. So this rock is called, it has a lot of terms. It's called Devil's Tower, which is the sort of the Western terminology, and it's also called Bear's Butte, which is sort of the indigenous. It's it's this incredible sort of tubular rock formation that juts out, and it's a really popular rock climbing site. And so there's been huge contestation over the indigenous communities. It's a very, very sacred site, and the indigenous communities asking the climbing community, can we need this place to rest just for a couple of days or a week throughout the year. We need it to rest because we need to go there and we need to give our gifts and we need to say our prayers, because this is one of our sacred spaces where we can help nurture the earth through our prayers, through our dance, through our stories, and through our offerings. And this has been going on for a really long time, that the climbing community, they're just this conservation and recreation community that you would seemingly think are all about nature. They're sort of have this contestation about allowing indigenous communities to come and pray, which honestly, praying where you want should be a God-given creator right of any single person. It's something that staunchly Western religious groups, are shouting from the roofs. Yet, when it in the face of indigenous communities coming to pray for the good of mankind and the good of the and health of the earth, there's just such contestation and fighting over this particular site. So yeah, that's another form of sort of colonization, territorialization of a sacred natural site here in the US.
Then I think it's a good moment, because I know we could talk for hours about the more high level stuff. You're an author of a book. It's called Lo-TEK, right? And I want the listeners to know both the genesis as well as the process design. What made that book alive in you before it came up as a book, and sketch some examples where you think, with your professional background of a landscape designer or like urban planning background, where some of these technologies can be adopted, and ideally, so that we don't stay only on the meta space,
Yeah.
really give some signs of hope where some of these examples in the library of your book really transpire and transmute the way urban planning and landscape architecture is done.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned before that the minute I started teaching and the reception that I got from my students about all these, we can call them indigenous technological landscapes that I feature in the book. There was such an incredible reception, and also from other professors when I would be sitting in design crits. I would start speaking about, well, have you looked at this type of a system? It's a food farming system. It's a flood mitigation system. It sequesters carbon. It does all these amazing things. And people would just look at me like, what are you talking about? How would I not know this example? Where does this ever exist? This sounds like fantasy. Um, and I think, like all really, really good, juicy pieces of research, Lo-TEK was a book that I was looking forward to read because I was so hungry to really understand, how do we design cities that are living and add to our lived in experience, rather than just a space to people to live and live in a half dead way. And so from the very beginning, when I couldn't find this book, I said, okay, I'm going to write the book. This is obviously what I'm supposed to do. um, and it was really me, we even within the profession, trying to tie this spiritual endeavors of study and trying to understand conservation and cultural landscapes, and tying it into the technological fascination, which was both really prevalent in my industry, but also I think globally incredibly prevalent. And I did that, and maybe this is an aha moment. I was one day working in this landscape in Bali, and writing the book and trying to think about technology for the course. And had I seen technology in this landscape, the cultural landscapes of Bali, which is the rice terrace systems, which is a sacred landscape controlled by water temples, and it's all organic rice farming. And I said, I mean, the rice terraces are cleaning the water, the rice terraces are growing the food, and the water is moving through that landscape without any outside power source. It's just gravitational energy. I mean, that's technology, right? And so I sort of, and then kind of like going back a little bit to a previous question, I realized that what the sacredness was also about was about in the landscape, was about preserving what human beings had needed to survive on. So it was really coming back and essentially saying, to survive, we need clean water, we need really good soils, and we need the food sources. And so those sacred landscapes, what they're preserving is the knowledge, the deep ecological knowledge, and the systems that had been set up in place, and the practices, and also the stories and songs that helped us remember those practices in time with the seasons. That was all the technology. So this was like a technology, but it was a very deeply nuanced technology that was cultural and oral and physical, but also metaphysical. And it contained these values of like reciprocity and respect and regeneration that is part of our principles of sustainability. um, and so going back to the genesis of Lo-TEK, I was teaching this course, and when I could find these examples in the literature, they were always called something that is in opposition to high tech, and that was low tech, Lowtech. And so the actual definition of low tech, Lowtech, is primitive and unsophisticated and born of industrial processes and materialities. And I was looking at all these incredibly sophisticated or very organic, complex, passive energy systems that were doing amazing things for civilizations. I was like, but this is not low tech. And this is like, just saturated in this colonial terminologies. And I was like, well, what would I call it if I understand these systems as based on traditional ecological knowledge and very localized to place, space, culture, and time? Well, for me, it's low tech, but it's Lotek. And it was also like a bit of a tongue in cheek, like poking fun at the system to be like,
Let me again tie into that,
yeah,
because what I want is primarily nurture the heart of the listeners to open themselves for, I would call it, sacred technologies or ancient future technologies. I don't want to steal your terminology of low
yeah,
tech, but what happened inside of me when you were sketching the genesis of the book was like, people are terracing the land using like the gravitational energy of the mother organism to cultivate rice for, I wouldn't say tens of thousands of years, but somewhat 10,000 years without the need for photovoltaics or
yeah.
fancy clean tech or
And it's
whatever.
pre-fossil fuel energy systems. That's what it is.
Exactly. So, what are two, three, maybe again, not five other examples that you can share with the listeners so that that an image, arises within the inner eye of the listeners, coming from the rice field, example? Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I'm just curious. What are the other examples that inspired you? Because you mapped hundreds, if not thousands, of them, and
Yeah,
you could portray a couple
yeah.
of dozen in the book.
I think the best one always to portray, given 60% of us live in cities, is a system that lies on the outskirts of Kolkata. It's called the East Kolkata wetlands. It's a completely man-made system that was built in a large wetland. It's fourth generation fish farmers, and they have manipulated this huge territory of wetland to create pools separated by bunds or dikes or walls, earthen walls. And this system apparently was initially accidentally happened, that there was a fish farmer. He was trying to feed his fish, and he realized that there was sewage water coming from the city of Calcutta, which is a city of 16, 17 million people. More than half of the city's water, sewage water, was coming down the river and moving into his fish farm, and his fish were thriving. Other fish farmers saw what was happening, started to adapt this wetland ecosystem to build more ponds for fish, cleaning more water, creating more food for the city because the city's population would then eat their fish. And so what occurred is this really large scale wastewater treatment system that is completely organic. It's an aquaculture system that feeds the city while cleaning its water supply. Not only does it do that, it supplants the need for a wastewater treatment plant, which costs the city of Calcutta about 22 million USD per year. So they don't have a wastewater treatment plant for the center of the city. It provides 10,000 jobs, informal jobs for the residents of the city. They grow lots of different foods and rice and vegetables around this system because the irrigation water is just right there. It's clean. They can irrigate those crops. And the other thing it does is it negates the need to transport from really long distances from rural landscapes food that's grown. So you can grow your food just, on the outskirts of your city. So it's really,
I love this example. What
yeah,
I always love, I would say that's my first big aha moment, is when some like neurons are clicking, that were not connected before. Because I come originally from Germany, moved full time to Guatemala. And when I imagine how dire the need is, to clean, gray water. I think one phase is more, okay, let's get the toxic, heavy metals out. But when we think of all the fertilizers
Yeah.
from the dominant species, which is mankind, and this could actually feed the fish instead of just building, like, let's say, cold concrete, sewage systems. It's
Chemically
really interesting.
treated,
Exactly.
coal fired. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it doesn't, it's
Exactly.
passive. You don't need energy source. You need the sun. It does it through a combination of sunlight and sewage
Yeah.
and settling systems and ponds and fish. I mean, it's this
Amazing.
amazing
Amazing.
system.
Why?
That's
Okay.
that's the
The
formula.
sacred rice farming, the
The
fish
wetlands.
using the sewage water, the gray water, the sewage water of Calcutta. And the third example?
Yeah, a third example. I mean, I'm going to give you the example from the cover of the book, which is the living tree root bridges, and this so the two systems that we spoke of before are vastly scalable systems as well. This system is quite site specific. It's a community that lives in a very, very, like, the wettest place on earth, up in northeastern India, in a place called Meghalaya, up in the clouds, and they live in this very, very hilly terrain. I've walked down the staircase. It takes hours to walk down this staircase into these ravines, into the territory of this particular community called the Wakasi. Um, and in normal periods outside the monsoon, you can walk through these hilly landscapes from village to village. Monsoon hits, this whole landscape floods. So, what you get now is islands of forests where villages are located, and then the lands between where you travel through to get from village to village you can't go through because there's ravines and rivers that are just rushing, they're just bursting with the monsoon rains. So what the Kasi have done is, for the last 1500 years, they've been growing bridges, and they do this. A grandfather will figure out a location along a river corridor between two villages. These bridges are owned by two different villages, and they will plant the Ficus elastica tree, which is a fig tree, two on either side of the river across from one another. And over time, as these trees begin to grow, really beautiful trees that, from the boughs of the first big boughs of the tree above the ground, they grow this thing called a secondary root system. So there's these roots that are strangling down from the boughs of the trees, and they take those roots that are looking for more earth and food and nutrients, and they weave them over a bamboo scaffolded bridge that they've constructed. And then that grandfather's son, he'll then take on, along with the rest of the people in the village, that process and that job of continuing to weave as these roots grow thicker and longer and stronger, weave those roots through that bamboo bridge until the root from one side is long enough to reach the opposite bank, and then they plant that root into the opposite bank, and they do that with the other side as well. So now you have two trees that are planted on either side of the bank of the river, constructed and woven and threaded over this bamboo scaffolded bridge. And eventually, through this incredible phenomenon called inosculation, these two trees, when they touch, their vascular systems become one. So these two trees actually merge into one single organism. And that tree just continues to grow and grow and grow. And it takes about 50 years in this particular landscape before you can really start traveling every single day, multiple people across this particular bridge. They have about 70, over 70, 75, 77 of these bridges in this territory of the Wakasi. And the particular tree that they use is considered a sacred tree. You can't pluck a leaf from this tree. You can't remove anything from the sides of the bank. And this tree is a bridge. It's a living infrastructure. it's more, I think, a paradigm and a model for what we could do when we think about living architecture or living infrastructure. But not only that, it stops the sides of the bank from of the river from eroding. It keeps the water tables up by sucking up all the water tables to keep them high. It really performs this sort of equilibrium function within that landscape to keep everything joined. And not only that, it keeps the villages harmonious because collectively one they share the ownership or the stewardship of this particular bridge, so they have to work together to keep it alive. So it's a process by which they can govern, by which they have a shared resource, by which they can travel to one another, and it aligns them um uh in in a lot of different ways, because then one village will have ownership with another village, so you keep on having this shared ownership through a landscape based upon these infrastructures, which are also considered sacred.
Then I think we're touching into a different topic now. It has to do a little bit with terminology. You were managing stewardship and co-ownership, because I truly think one of the biggest problems of, I would say, the dominant colonizing culture is to create artificial boundaries in between systems. So the original version of the limited liability company was that the owner of a slave did not need to be liable for the fact when a slave, for example, fell sick. So he kind of could insure the slaveholder from, holding the slave. And here you were mentioning a beautiful metaphor of two different villages basically sharing the ownership, the governance, the stewardship structure of two trees becoming one organism. I'm not saying one tree, but one, let's say, one ecosystem, one closed organism, and how important it is to radically unlearn and relearn the ways we govern our dominant culture and our economic system. Um, Julia, I know you somewhat in some circles became a famous bestseller author, but you have also received criticism.
Yeah.
You're a white woman, you're not indigenous, even though I would say to the roots, we're all indigenous. We all have a weird pool of genetics. But let's say, yeah, what is the criticism you have faced? And I want to not lose ourselves in like Me Too, the dark side of the Me Too and colonial, or the whole masquerading the colonial conversation by the alt right. But I want to ask you more about your learnings. What have you grown as a human being through being confronted with all that criticism?
Yeah. I mean, I'll say I had worked in the space of sacred cultural landscapes for about 15 years. Um, and I received way more criticism and stepped on way more sanctified territories and toes in that space, and learned really a lot. And this book and the framework around this book encapsulated so many of those learnings, like understanding that while you might have an interest in sacred landscapes, who are you to be the vessel that should receive these learnings, and why do you want to know? And a healthy skepticism, based upon where I come from and who I am, and also healthy skepticism about academics. At that time, I was primarily an academic. Um, I mean, I have faced, interestingly, a lot of criticism, mostly from other non-Indigenous academics working in the same field, who really diligently like to remind me of all the ways I could be, whether I am or have be, you know, breaking codes of conduct and best practice models about how to work with Indigenous communities. Often I mean, the work has always really primarily happened from a discussion with a community, or a request by an individual or an expert within that community, or upon me approaching a particular person or individual, a real um, a latent need by them to have their stories, and this, I would say, there's these incredible technologies that you have, and they would look at me like, yeah, we know that, like, you're not telling me anything that we don't know. Um and so there was this, and I think that always, if you speak to indigenous activists within this same space that I am working in, many of them will say that it's always been the intention to share this knowledge with uh, the world, with the intention that will be used for good. And um, I think that, there's been a model in the US, to get a little bit off track, of indigenous communities are always incredibly have been very hospitable in all ways, with information, with knowledge, and we've seen that happen to an incredible detriment. And so that side of the detriment is, I think, where I have encountered the skepticism. And, it has been from, you shouldn't be speaking about these things, to, um, you know, absolute praise and thanks, and huge, wonderful, fantastic friendships born of the research and the work. But for me, I began the work working with particular communities and specific knowledge keepers and activists within those communities, saying, can we share this knowledge? Would you like to write about this? Um, and then to the very opposite end of the spectrum, where I have begun writing something and gotten really deep into an exploration, while also trying to contact members of a community to say, look, I have a lot of published literature and a lot of published research, which I have composed into a really, what I think is a very strong chapter, which represents this technology. Would you like to work with me to keep on evolving that research? And they just flat out say, no, this is not something we will share. And in that, we have to say, absolutely, it is your knowledge, it's yours to keep. For, it primarily belongs to community, and primarily should be told by community. I think for me, with the first book, the chapters, while they were worked on with community, and I had a number of interviews, always done in native language first, and always published in native language first, and then translated into English and published in English, um, with the intention to make the book as available, and the information to be received as by many of the participants in their own language first as possible. Um, um, but that I've lost my train of thought. Um, that now I've understood that that's not enough. Chapters have to be co-authored. There has to be an engagement from the outset, so that the knowledge that is shared, all of that knowledge, is led by community. And I think that's something I'll say, like, to your question about, like, what is the biggest shift in the way you think about this subject matter. It's that, um, this knowledge and these knowledge systems and these technologies are so valuable, and have been spoken about by indigenous communities and peoples for a really long time, as having the potential to have such a great contribution to the climate conversation, and to the care of Mother Earth, and to the intergenerational timescale that we need to be able to achieve with the way that we're inhabiting the Earth. But that um, that now I've lost my train of thought again. Um,
Let me tie into that. I
yeah,
don't think you have lost the train of thought. We're perfectly segueing into a very interesting part of the conversation. I would say the most speculative, but from a metaphysical ontological perspective, for me, one of the very pivotal ones is I grew up in a paradigm, meaning in Western culture, of linear time, right? There was a big bang, and then out of nothing, the universe was born. Intuitively, I'm just saying from myself, like intuitively, that never made sense.
Yeah.
Like how is nothing born out of something? Because at the same time, growing up with the natural cycles of nature, at least in the context of us, living from the land and planting the seeds and then harvesting and then composting, including the normal life cycles as a human being in every living system. Something gets born, something lives, and something dies. And I want to contrast that when I met my now partner Lucia, that is born in Guatemala. And actually, the second time we met with a Mayan maestro, so a spiritual, very humble guy, obviously all in Spanish. And he's the timekeeper. And in the Mayan mythology, in the Mayan ontology, like much like in the Vedic, in the Hindu context now in India, time is not linear. They just don't perceive it as linear. Their whole ontology is built that time is cyclical.
Yeah.
And the Mayans have built a very complex, I would call it infrastructure, right? Or ancient modern technology, right? To really perceive yourself more in cyclical ways. And I wonder how some of these ancient future technologies, the Lo-TEK that you're trying to preserve through your book and other endeavors, comes from let's say, maybe a different cycle and gets infused into a new cycle. And I don't want to just talk through that like as a dry swimming metaphysical exercise, but I really, in the way that I perceived, in the way that I channel, in the way that I sense the future of humanity, we are at an inflection point.
Yeah.
So for me, it's not to be against high tech. It's not to be against the internet. It's not to be against artificial intelligence or machine learning. It's how can we merge these different cycles of wisdom?
Yeah.
So it's less of a question, but more a joint inquiry,
Yeah.
right? How can these different cycles of wisdom nourish each other to then merge and birth a new civilization?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is actually like a huge reflection um, for the next book, and it was born out of me really looking at this next book based on water as sort of latently underneath that as energy, and that all of these systems are energetic systems, passive energy system, pre-fossil fuel energy systems that work because they work with circularity and cyclical time. And so we had and in indigenous communities, this idea of cyclical time, like you mentioned, this is the prevalent understanding of time. And even if we go back, to a concept of really really deep time, what we are at right now is this sort of crossroads, this that's been prophesized by the Hopi, by Anishinaabe, and they say we're in a time where we can choose one path, or we can choose another, one path of green and one path of destruction. So this time has been seen, and it's either the fifth in the Hopi or the seventh in the Anishinaabe. But what they're talking about is huge, huge circles of time, and these circles of time sort of follow a pathway um, of changing, leading to crises, or like a moment of shifting, a collapse, a regeneration, and a rebirth. And so you keep on seeing these same patterns. And we talk about, these indigenous knowledge systems. What they're really about is they're understanding really vast patterns that happen over really big territories or really long time scales. And so while we say this time that we're at now has been prophesized, really it's just an understanding of looking at patterns over vast amounts of times and understanding how these patterns keep on playing out. And just like it happens with daily tidal movements twice a day, or a full moon tide, a king tide once a month, or a woman's cycle once a month, or the seasons with the winter hibernation and sort of the sleep of the land, and then the awakening of the land with spring and summer, or the annual cycles of the earth rotating around the sun. We have these cyclical patterns that our energy systems are completely aligned with, our bodies are aligned with, all other species are aligned with, our pre-fossil fuel energy systems we're aligned with. And what we've done, and it's talked about as like beginning in Sumerian time, but really, really exacerbated and becoming sort of omnipresent during colonization and ongoing industrialization, is a linear time, past, present, future. We are always moving and evolving towards an end that is sort of, where will that be? Who knows? But the past is gone. We are in the present, and the future is to arrive. Rather than understanding we're just going through these time cycles. Um, what I think is so interesting is these energy systems, they do have these checks and balances of understanding how to exist within finite resources, and understanding how to capture daily sunlight, or use microbial actions to clean, or using decay of a life cycle of a plant as a performance of buoyancy to create a floating island settlement. Like these, the power of understanding cyclical time can be captured in so many different ways to create incredibly sustainable systems and structures and infrastructures. And when you really understand that, you can really deeply engage that to build civilizations based upon this. What I see
Yeah, I just
now,
wanted to
yeah,
tie into that, because I would say, from my understanding of physics, uh, but also my metaphysical understanding and my plant medicine journeys, is there is no straight line, right? There is no straight line. I always tell people, right, that there is not a 90-degree angle in the universe, right? It's just an abstraction. Even a straight tree will always be slightly bent. All we can perceive is like patterns. All we can perceive is frequency, is vibration, is movement. So just really from a bare bone physical perspective, to think about time as linear, like a line, is like, where the fuck in nature do you see a line, right? You see a river meandering, carving its way through the rock and
I
the
mean, it's just a
soil and everything.
reductiveness of trying to understand
Exactly.
like an incredible complexity, but reducing it to this perception that also was reflected in religion, of your ancestor, you're now, and then when you die, you're in heaven, and that's it. There's this is You can do whatever you want here because you'll be forgiven and you'll go somewhere
Yeah, yeah,
else, and it won't
totally.
matter. Um,
What
there's no entanglement. It doesn't even
what
take this idea of entanglement into account.
what patterns do you sense of, after, I would say, ballpark 500 years of deep colonization, um, and the inflection point that we are? Because what I'm most curious, always towards the last end of the podcast, is to look into the crystal ball, because I think once we allow ourselves to look into the crystal ball of the unborn, the void, the unmanifest, the future, whilst we are imagining and co-imagining that future together, we're actually creating it.
Yeah.
Because in my understanding, and I just made an intro this morning, we won't talk about that in this podcast. I think we're at an absolute magical inflection point.
Yeah.
We have the collective intelligence, the collective wisdom, abundantly, always, everywhere present, at close to zero costs. I'm not saying it's zero cost, but close to zero cost, like the global internet. Many people can communicate across like time and space. So I actually see a huge opportunity where the preservation of ancient old technology, or low tech in your terminology, can merge with high tech AI. And just as mentioned sewage systems, out of Calcutta, is it not possible to co-imagine that maybe a lot of emerging economies, instead of building like
Absolutely.
bricks and mortar sewage systems, maybe they should just build ponds made out of clay or whatever material they have at hand and clean the water
Yeah.
and grow fish at the same time in the metropolitan areas? I mean, that should be abundantly clear
Yeah.
after the podcast
Yeah.
that there are so many amazing technologies, low-tech technologies that can be used.
Yeah.
So my more specific question would be, in the context of your working environment and having published a book and preparing for the second book, where do you see ancient future, low tech and high tech merging in an urban environment, but also in other cases?
I mean, it's already the biggest question I always get asked, and it's similar to the question you're asking, is like, how can we really scale, or how are these different examples that you show, how do they find themselves and place themselves within a London or a New York, or any other different metropolitan? And this book was really an answer to that. So um, one thing is, I will say, is one big shift that I see that's really kind of latent and hasn't been recognized, is that it's already happening. And I was when I I I wanted to make this book half about these case studies of indigenous technologies that existed for hundreds or thousands of years, that were still fully formed and functioning in a very vital and culturally relevant way. And then the next half of the book, I wanted to find contemporary applications, whether they are new material technologies that are blended high tech and low tech, LO-TEK, or conservation projects, or architectural projects, or urban planning, or climate resilience projects where it's already happened. It's not that it's going to happen, or we can start to sort of theoretically, conceptually conceive of the possibility of this happening. It is already happening. So one of those examples, um, and this is a big shift that I see, is that traditional ecological knowledge is already being infused into some of the most well-known, high-functioning, climate-resilient urban landscapes that we have presently in the world today. There's a model called Sponge City by Kongzhan Yu of Turenscape. He's a Chinese landscape architect. Incredible work, really prevalent work. He has this model called Sponge City, and it's now a model for collecting stormwater and managing water in an urban environment, cleaning water, growing food, making it a wonderful recreational space. Really, whether it's the interior of a city, on a river or a wetland or a coastal shoreline, it doesn't matter. It's the ability for this particular urban landscape to absorb water, to to clean it, to grow food, to create really incredible biodiverse landscapes in those particular environments. And it's a model that, the mayor of Paris speaks about. It's talked about in the United States. This model had never, ever, ever been written about as having been infused or inspired by traditional ecological knowledge. So within this next book, I I spoke to many of my colleagues who were designing the most groundbreaking climate resilient urban landscapes in the world, and I asked them, are any of your projects inspired by traditional ecological knowledge, or are they infused with methodologies, design methodologies taken directly from precedents, uh, of traditional ecological knowledge precedents? And Kongzhan was like, yeah, Sponge City. It's looking at the traditional cut and fill technologies and the planting methods, and restoration processes of farmers. There's, to have the most talked about climate resilience water management model presently on Earth, never spoken about within the context of TEK, is to me mind-boggling. But for me, it's such an incredible, powerful understanding that we are already the blueprints of the next generation of how we design cities to be really living, vibrant, based upon Lo-TEK. It's already happening. It's already been seeded.
I always say the future is already
It's
here,
happening.
right?
It's happening.
It's already here.
We're in the confluence of this.
Exactly, exactly. I feel like asking you one or two last questions before we're wrapping it up. The thing is, if the future is already here, um,
Intention.
let's let's go into the dream time. When you dream about the confluence of low tech and high tech, and infusing high tech with ancient future technology, um, what do you sense happening? I'm less so interested in the Horizon 1, on a Horizon 2, let's say the next 3 to 5 years. And then instead of asking you for the classical Horizon 3, like where is Julia and her work in 10 years, what is your generational perspective? If you get, I don't know how old you imagine to to be before you hand over to the next generation, but maybe rather in the next 50 years or something like that. What do you sense happening, and what do you wish to happen? What do you dare to imagine to happen in this one precious lifetime?
I mean, those timescales are quite small when you think of the timescales of the systems that I speak to. So maybe we have some flexibility in 3 to 5 that they can
Please, please,
expand.
you can also go intergenerational.
No, I almost think like I feel like a really to understand how many different wheels need to be turned at different times to create, those site specific projects. They're happening. I see new material technologies emerging that are blending high tech and low tech, co-created by indigenous and non-indigenous designers and communities. And I have 22 of them that I have profiled, but we didn't use all the examples that we have, and there are so many more that are happening. So there is this, I call it the age of technology, TEKNOLOGY. Um, and I see a birth of a, I think a group of people, or a sort of a role of technologists, TEK. I think that what is happening is that this idea that we can blend ancestral knowledge and understandings with the best uh, of those types of systems, and it has to be infused with the intention and the values, um, and the understandings of reciprocity and respect and care and abundance and uh, giving, a shift from giving culture to a shift to a giving culture from a taking culture. All these things, they're very important. I think sometimes they're the hardest things to conceive of happening, but I think that it's always been, I've always thought that the cultural shift is like the most important thing, and I now I understand it's more the intentional shift. um but it's seeding itself in lots of different spaces. It's seeding itself within industries, it's seeding itself within governance, it's seeding itself within, United Nations. I see talk from like international, intergovernmental, to national institutions. My institution in the United States, it's the ASLA, American Society of Landscape Architects. I just gave the general keynote for the annual meeting side by side with a really amazing indigenous scientist, a Diné woman, Dr. Lila June Johnson, who wrote the foreword for my next book, where we set the intention of the industry national meeting. And with that, I made them write a call to action that they would build indigenous knowledge systems into how the institution works, into our education for our young architects and landscape architects coming up. um, that there's just, I see that there's this space for co-creation with the with the realization that the existential crisis will be experienced by all, and then to meet that, we need to work together. Um, my my dream, my which it happened again this morning as I was reading, was like I have these like moments of sort of pure clarity for like where I see things moving. Is that, you know, we see these incredible cities emerging in spaces and places around the globe, often in places like the global, we call the global south, for whatever that might mean. Um, and they're often seeded with ideas of designers and developers that are not from those specific locations, and they're sort of emblematic of an idea of progress and sustainability, well, or lack of sustainability, that is incredibly troubling. My idea is that we're going to shift away from doing these sort of uh, completely unsustainable and uh, non-resilient, huge new urban developments towards a model that really starts to infuse the framework of Lo-TEK and of indigenous knowledge systems into how we design the systems, the spaces, the industries, the economies, the governance, um, the experience of cyclical time played out into an urban morphology. And that's, I think, maybe like the 15-year, what I what I think will be the next huge shift, going from site specific to sort of morphological within an urban landscape, to the way we think and conceive of inhabiting space together.
Um, I wonder, do you ever receive visions or images or stories or frequencies that are even more bold and daring, more connected to deep time and intergenerational vision? If not, it's totally fine. But what I sensed you were describing is still like, I think that's not just like, I think it's at least very likely, or at least like very probable. I would still call that the near term. I think some people would call it Horizon 3 if you say like 15 years. But I think that's very likely to happen, just like how the human brain develops. I mean, it's once you understand everything is like cybernetically, everything is connected, everything are nested systems within nested systems, everything is like complex living systems dynamics.
Mm.
Is there a vision you ever received beyond your deathbed intergenerationally, where what you're seeding, or less maybe so seeding, what you're building a library of and a community of, has taken roots that are so strong, right, that they carry the trajectory of humanity into a new paradigm? And have you received?
I mean, I would say, I think, I don't know if this is receiving something. What I see happening and what I feel like I'm sort of bringing forth and part of is a shift in, I think, what we see as a world where materiality comes first and then consciousness comes last. And everything is built on materiality and material sciences. And then this idea of sort of spirituality and consciousness is a sort of the the underneath that or below that. I think what is happening, and I see it in sort of science, this blend, and I see it in academia. I see it in the understandings of indigenous knowledge systems, where, and by consciousness I mean like spiritual consciousness, that, and the reason why indigenous knowledge was always said, sort of talked about as unscientific, is because it very openly spoke about spirituality and consciousness and energy systems and life force uh, being blended as part of like technology and material practice. What I see is that our conception of technology will change and shift, and that consciousness will come first, and we'll understand that this connection that we have, the life force, the mana in some languages, or wakan, like so many different ways that people talk about this in indigenous languages, that's actually what we're getting back to. The like really, really deep connection of um, energetic life force that is the basis for the functioning of the everything. This is what we're, and that's what I mean when I say I want to build an urban morphology that responds to that. It's not just that it responds to the materiality of everything, it's building life force. And that's what indigenous communities are doing when they're taking care of their land. They're building the life force of that land so that that life force feeds back into the people. And that's what I think, that's my, that's like the biggest vision, is that's where we'll get to within the profession and the big shift with humanity.
Julia, I have nothing to add. I would say it's the most fundamental, I would say the most obvious. And I think when we look at the Mayan prophecies, which are pretty similar actually to the to the Hopi ones, it's becoming aware that ultimately everything is connected through time and space in all times and all generations and all universes, all at the same time, and becoming ultimately aware as the dominant species, as that. I'm super grateful life makes us meet. My gut feeling is, after I always had the feeling I want to do something with Julia, now we really have the possibility. Thanks so much for this conversation. I really loved it. It was at the same time metaphysical, super grounded, and yeah, just looking forward to helping to steward more of this ancient old technology, or in your terminology, low tech. Thanks so much for the conversation, Julia.
Thank you.